Hello students, Mr. Young here with Chapter 23, Lesson 5. It's called Society and Industry. So we have a big lesson today, but I'm just not sure we have time to break it down, so we're going to eat it all today. So we've learned about the Industrial Revolution and how now people use machines to make goods faster and better. We learned how factories are expensive and selling shares of ownership makes corporations and so on and so forth like that. We learned all the technical stuff, but how did these changes affect the Joe Schmoes of the world? Today we find out. There we go. Alright, first off, the growth of industrialization. With it you had urbanization. That is to say, people were moving away from the country, from rural areas into the city. Why was that? Well, there were two reasons. Number one, factories were in the city, so that's where the jobs were. And then new farming tools meant that less people could grow more food, so there's less work in the country. So less work in the country, more country in the city, more work in the city leads to urbanization. Now, industrialization created a great deal of jobs and growth. The middle class expanded rapidly. Folks like teachers, clerks, and managers of the factories, as well as owners of the factories, all entered the middle class. In this time period, the middle class gained wealth and power. You also had massive gains in working class population. These are essentially the laborers. In the working class family, everyone had to work to support the family. That meant men, women, and children. These folks work 16 hours a day, 6 days a week, get off on Sundays. Factory conditions were horrible, as were the living conditions of these people in their tenant housing. Despite grueling hours and miserable conditions, people kept moving into the city and kept taking factory jobs. It was just more money than they could make out on the farm. As time progressed, working conditions did get better. Hours were shortened, and some safety measures were taken. Now, we've been following the rights and roles of women throughout the course. In the late 1800s, early 1900s, women were challenging their traditional roles as housewives. More opportunities were becoming available to women in terms of work outside the home as well as education. Now, with the Industrial Revolution came changes, some good, some bad. And there were new problems, like the terrible conditions of the working class. There were some differing ideas on how to solve these problems. One of these ideas was liberalism. Not so much as you think of it now, but as an ideology based on the ideals of the Enlightenment and French Revolution, which weren't really that long ago when you're talking about, early 1900s. The keystones of this liberalism are individual rights and limited government. That sounds pretty accurate. At the time, liberals thought elected legislatures should make the laws and be elected by property-owning males. Liberalism was mostly championed by the middle-class business folk. The growing middle class, they were into liberalism. It's easier to make money with little government involvement in business as well as society, and they thought things were better off that way. These thoughts were all written down in great length in Adam Smith's The Wealth of Nations, which is still a very influential book to this day. It's basically a book on the origins of capitalism and how it's great. In Britain, liberalism was a bit different. Limited government and individual rights were still important, but they thought government should play an active role in making society better. John Stuart Mill and Jeremy Bentham headed this sort of British liberalism idea, which would be described as utilitarian, meaning the most good, doing the most good for the most amount of people. British liberals believed in rights for women, better education, and health services for all. Now, on sort of the opposite end of the spectrum as American liberalism is socialism. In socialism, it is believed that everyone should own all the land, labor, and raw materials, instead of like an elite few. Now, not everyone can run the factory, so even if they owned it, that wouldn't make any sense. So the government would basically manage all of these factors of production. And in theory, the wealth, the money made, would be spread out to everyone, being equally distributed to all. Some of the earliest socialists set up their own mill towns and sort of experiments. Like Robert Owen, who set up his mill in Scotland, and while he did not practice full-blown socialism, like he still owned his own factory, he did greatly improve the working and living conditions of his worker, and then they were more productive. Now, Karl Marx was a socialist. Some thought that guys like Robert Owen weren't going far enough. For example, Karl Marx was a socialist that thought all the classes were in a constant struggle against each other, and he thought that the working class, what he called the proletariat, would revolt and overthrow the ruling class and then create a communist society with no social classes, because everyone would be in the same class, because everyone would get an equal share of the wealth, so there would be no rich, no poor, just everyone together making the same amount of money. People that believed in Marxist theories were called, well, Marxists. There he is, Karl Marx right there. Alright, of note, a great deal of improvement for the working class came from labor unions. Labor unions were organized groups of laborers working to improve conditions. The most common strategy was to strike, or basically stop working, in order to pressure management into making changes. Things like more pay, or no pay cuts, or shorter hours, or better safety conditions, or no child labor, things like that. Alright, there's a little section in this lesson about the arts. So, we're already pretty well into this lesson. Where are we? 7 minutes in, about? Okay, so we're going to break this down. In the late 1700s, the Enlightenment ideals of logic and reason were kind of mainstream, and they began to have cultural kickback, a counterculture, if you will. Artists like William Wordsworth and Goethe, and even Ludwig van Beethoven, wrote music, wrote poems, or painted pictures with the purpose to stir emotion and express inner feelings. So sort of a kickback to the cold reason and logic. Now we're getting into feelings again. This movement was called Romanticism. Another artistic viewpoint was realism. These artists wanted to portray life as it really was, be it the poor country living or a harsh urban life. Charles Dickens is the most famous of the realists of this time. He wrote A Christmas Carol, like Tiny Tim and Scrooge. That was all like real life. It was very realistic, very realist sort of play. There we go, bah humbug. Alright, in the late 1800s, we saw another movement known as modernism. These sort of artists kind of focused on contemporary issues at the time, things like women's rights and alcoholism. Alright, a crash course on science. In 1859, Charles Darwin made waves with his book On the Origins of Species, which was basically his theory of evolution. Now, this was a touchy subject at the time. I guess it can kind of still be, as it challenged the biblical story of creation. Darwin had concluded that over time the genetic traits of all plants and animals that helped them survive would propagate, while undesirable traits would die off. In an oversimplified statement, the smartest monkeys survived to become smarter monkeys, and smarter monkeys until they evolved into humans, as you can see with the graphic. Alright, in the late 1800s, a fellow named Gregor Mendel discovered how traits are passed from parents to offspring by studying and breeding pea plants. For example, I have what is known as the awesome gene. Assuming my wife also has the awesome gene, our son will grow up to be awesome too. Yuck, yuck, yuck. There he is. Alright, also in science, in the 1800s, we saw significant medical breakthroughs. Vaccinations were discovered, as were germs and bacteria being things, helping people not to get sick and die all the time. They also found that if you sterilized medical instruments, people wouldn't, die of infection after operations. So that was pretty cool. They also discovered anesthesia, so patients wouldn't feel the doctor cutting them up or whatnot. So that's pretty super too. Albert Einstein also came up with the theory of relativity, which I'm not even going to try to explain because I teach history. Alright, that is the big lesson we had for the day. Little Einstein quote here at the end. Anyone who has never made a mistake has never tried anything new. Well said, Einstein. You have a 10-point quiz, 5 questions. Nothing crazy, I pulled it right from the lesson. That was lesson 5. That was the whole thing. That's the whole chapter. So we have a study day, tomorrow, test day, and then boom, imperialism and World War I, I think. Sounds fabulous. Alright, study day, test day. Yeah, we'll knock that out. Look for that coming up tomorrow. And hey, if you have any questions for today's lesson on the quiz, anything like that, please let me know. Have a good one.